Welcome to another edition of the Revealing the Diamond podcast. I'm your host, the Lion of Love, Tiaga Prem Singh, bringing you all things elevating, all things higher consciousness, from the realms of yoga, meditation, music, plant-based living, recovery. This week we sit down with Chris Grosso of the Indie Spiritualist, an amazing man, gentle soul, teacher, healer, the author of several books, including the Indie Spiritualist. The book I'm right into now for study and education, elevating my mind and spirit, is called Dead Set on Living. Lots of conversations with incredible teachers, including Gabor Mate, which we discuss in the interview. If you like what we do here on Revealing the Diamond, make sure you get on over to iTunes podcasts or whatever platform you're listening on and give us a rating and a review. Share it with your friends so we can reach more people, share these teachings. Because let's face it, right now these are challenging times. And the more we can reach out, share, elevate, heal, the better chance we have as leaders during this time, navigating some of the uncertainty. If you have just started listening to the show, make sure you go back and listen to some of the previous episodes. There's classes, lectures, some great early conversations with me and Richie Newridge, which, by the way, we will have him back on the show and we'll turn the tables. I'll ask him some questions about social media, etc. If you want to get in touch with me, you can find me on Instagram at Tiaga Prem or the Dharma Temple. If you're in Vancouver, come visit us at the Center for Elevation and Spiritual Living, the Dharma Temple on Main and 17th. Or email me at tiagaprem@thedharmatemple.com. I'll respond to all emails, questions, bookings, whatever it is. But without further ado, let's tune into this great conversation about recovery, about spirituality, and about living as the best version of you, with none other than Chris Grosso. Love you. We'll see you soon. If you're going to Solstice in New Mexico, hit me up. We can hang. I'll be there the whole time. Love you. Sat Ram. Well, thanks a lot, Chris. It's really great to have you here on Revealing the Diamond.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's definitely an honor. Appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome. I first heard of you. I was listening to some of the podcasts on Tommy Rosen's Recovery 2.0 podcast, and I wasn't familiar with your work at all, but I really love just listening to you talk. So that's kind of where I heard about the work that you're doing. And then, yeah. And then
I appreciate that. That's how most conversations start. Yeah, I heard you on here or there, and I didn't know who the hell you were, but hey, nice job. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
glad I'm getting out there.
That's right. And then from there, I have started your latest book, and I listened to a lot of things as we were talking about before the record here. But I went for a walk and just kept walking because I love the new book. It's so great.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, and I wondered if maybe since I'm coming at this from a place where I don't know as much about your story except for what I've read in the new book, if we could maybe talk a little bit about what I love about it is that you're taking all of these different angles of spiritual practice, and I can relate to that, and then applying it in such an accessible way in a language that really connects with me. And I just wondered if we could talk a little bit about that process of
how you got from where you were to where you are.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely a very fair place to start. Boy, the majority, not the majority, but a bulk of the work I do today is with younger people. And that is not to say that I don't work with, anyone from, and I'm not calling anyone 40 or above old because I'm about to turn 40, but, for example, 40 to 70, 80. My podcast that I host is on Ram Dass's network, and, a large portion of their listenership is older than I am. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to kind of cross not just age, but cultural and all sorts of boundaries. But yes, I guess a lot of the work I do is geared a little more towards, and I use this term lightly, but the younger generation of seekers. And for anyone listening to your show, they can take that, as whatever they want it to be. But the reason I say that is I went through, and this is a very nutshell condensed version, but I went through several years of active addiction and getting sober and relapsing, and it was just awful. It led to jail cells, emergency rooms, psychiatric hospitals, suicide attempts, rehabs, detoxes, all of that ugliness that comes along with basically struggling with addiction in whatever form it takes. And so today, again, that was a that was a really nice nutshell, and we can unpack that any more if you want as we go on. But going back to your main question, as I write, my third book just came out, the one you're listening to, Dead Set on Living. But with all three books, the one thing I do intentionally try to do with each one is keep my roughly 19-year-old self in mind. And I do that because that's the point in my life where I crossed over from, if you study addiction or those kinds of behaviors, it typically goes from experimentation to regular use to abuse to full-on addiction. And I made my way from abuse to full-on addiction around the age of 19. So when I write, I try to write keeping that 19-year-old self in mind, with the hopes that, maybe another 19 or even whatever, 17, 15, 13-year-old might read a bit about what I've gone through, and it could potentially, on a good day, potentially help them avoid many of the pitfalls that I've gone down time and time again. So, yeah, I don't know. That's a bit about me and why I write the way I do, or how I present the material I do. I found a tremendous amount of inspiration from the mystic or kind of raw elements of all the great wisdom traditions, whether it's Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism, whatever it may be. They've all meant something to me at their core, not the dogmatic elements, but, and I'm not bashing anyone that is into that. I make very clear in my books and my talks, to each their own, period. Whatever works for you, as long as you're a good person with a good heart, serving humanity, not ostracizing others, not harming others, then great, whatever. So, yeah, so it's been important for me to, while sharing a bit of my own journey, my books are never like fully autobiographical or biographical, whatever. They do intertwine my life experience, because I have no problem throwing myself under the bus. Who'd know better than me about, the fallibility, if that's actually even a word, but of being a human. So, yeah, that's essentially, again, condensed, but where I come from, why I come from that perspective, and it's really just with the intention of trying to make this material as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, without also watering it down. I'm not a fan of watered down new agey spirituality. And we could just leave it at that. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah. I can really, I think what I relate to so much when I'm listening to the new book is that I often joke and say most of my life I've had one foot in the nightclub and one foot in the ashram. And even my name, which is Tiaga Prem, Tiaga is like a form of renunciation where, kind of like in the Bhagavad Gita, where you're renouncing the fruits of your actions, not like a
Yes.
sannyasa where you give everything up, but and then Prem obviously means love, and I think that's been sort of my whole life, where it's like all or nothing. And I've been involved in music, and I would turn my back on a spiritual life and drugs and alcohol and the whole bit, and then I would be like, well, that doesn't work, so I would go way to the other extreme and try and stop everything, and without really looking at why I was doing that in the first place, and swinging
Yeah.
back and forth and back and forth. And it took me, 20 years to come to some understanding. And I still get confused all the time.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
but I think when you read something, even as somebody who's, in recovery and who's 37 years old, when I'm reading a book, even written from that perspective, I feel like you can even go back into some of the things that happened and experience some healing, even if you're not 19 years old, even if you were going through that process at 19 years old.
Yeah. Uh, Completely agreed. And it's kind of been a running joke. Well, not anymore, but I remember after I wrote my first book, it was so emotionally draining to go back to those places.
Mm.
Because I was, writing about them, really reliving them. And anyone who is in a formal fellowship of the 12 steps, and I'm not here to advocate one over the other or any, period. I know people have found recovery, if we're speaking to that extent, um, strictly in other routes. So, all I advocate for is find what works for you, go with that. Um,
Mm.
but anyone who's written on steps, or a fourth step particularly, which is where you kind of bring up all the muck that's inside of you, writing these books has almost been an equivalent to a certain extent of that, because I'm very transparent. And so yeah, even going back to 19 and reliving certain experiences through writing and rehashing, uh, brings up a lot. And so what I was saying about that running joke was, I am now divorced, but when I was with my ex-wife, when I finished my first book, I don't remember saying this, but I remember it was such a daunting process that I said to her, I'm done. Like, I'm never writing another book again. And then a year later, I was finishing my second book. And I said to
Mm.
her, like, I guess, like, basically verbatim, the same thing. And she laughed at me, and I was like, what's funny about that? Like, because I was in a very emotionally distraught, place when I said that.
Right.
And she's like, you don't remember? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she said, you said basically the same exact thing at the end of your first book. And I was just like, oh, okay. And so here we are now, a third book later, a divorce later, and God bless her soul, where, we don't talk often, if really ever, but not a bad breakup. She's an amazing human being. But yeah, so anyways, breakup happens, third book comes out, and now it's just like, yeah, life. Who knows? Who knows?
Right. Well, I know I went to treatment the first time when I was 20 years old, and I kind of had the
Wow. Yeah.
attitude when I came out of there that I was like, well, I don't, as long as I don't do the hard drugs, drinking isn't really that big of a deal. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was really interested in spiritual practices. And because I come from the West, and we sort of where we worship at the realm of the intellect, I thought, well, then I'll just go to university and learn about the practices. Well, here's the thing: if you just know about them intellectually, then there's no experiential component, and it really doesn't. I mean, it's useful, but it doesn't really work on the
Sure.
heart, I guess. And I often
Right.
make a joke about Alan Watts where I say he was such a blessing and a curse in my life because uh, I always was like, well, if he can, have a glass of vodka beside him while he's sharing the Dharma, why can't I? And
Sure.
I
Just
held
like
on.
Trungpa Rinpoche. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So I held on to that for a long time until things really fell apart, and I had to take a look at myself, and then I was able to put the bottle down just doing Kundalini yoga over the past 3 years of my life, and I didn't go back to a meeting or a treatment. I just committed to getting up early in the morning and doing my sadhana, and I had had enough.
Yeah. And that's what's beautiful. And that's why I was saying the precursor, like, before, it's a very individualized process, just like Ram Dass would say about the spiritual path, regardless of whether you're addicted to a particular substance or not, though, you talk to certain spiritual teachers or certain people in general, and I'd be one of them who would say, hey man, you're a human being. There's no way you're not addicted to something, at the very
Right.
least, thinking, because even if you are a dedicated meditation practitioner, you're still, your thoughts, they come and go, and they happen, and it's something that you're unable to control. So, we're all addicted to something in one way or another. We're all in recovery to something one way or another. At least that's been my experience, and yeah, so I don't know, man. I really appreciate that, you're sharing that, because again, a lot of the work I do is when I go into these younger facilities. I do 3 workshops a month where I work with 13 to 20-year-olds, both male and female, and that can be a very difficult dynamic, and I get it, because when I was 13, 14, I was introduced to punk rock and hardcore music, and that to me is what really initiated, without me having any knowledge around it, my actual spiritual experience, because it taught me to start questioning everything, just like the Buddha
Yeah.
would say, essentially, like, I can sit here and talk to you all day about my experience, but whatever, find out for yourself. And so, bringing these practices that have helped me, whether Buddhist or not, can be tricky. So, trying to find a way to incorporate them in a language and a persona and just perspective that is relatable to younger people. Um, Boy, it's been tough, but I'll tell you what, it's been joyously tough, I guess. Because it's made me like reevaluate a lot in my life and relook at things, and re-explore my own past. So, quite a quite an interesting time.
Yeah, no kidding. I can relate on the punk and hardcore. I mean, I came up with that. I actually have Russ Rankin, the singer from Good Riddance. I wrote him a note and said, you're the whole reason that I'm a vegan and why I got interested in getting sober all those years ago. It took me a long time. And
Nice.
I know maybe, it's not your usual interview to come on a spiritual podcast, but would you be down to do it? And he said, oh yeah. So I'm going to have Russ from Good Riddance on in the next little bit
That
here.
is awesome. Cool, man. I love
Yeah.
hearing
So
stuff like that. And that's why on my podcast, I try to have like same thing, like people who not necessarily are quote unquote, spiritual teachers, or, have that particular interest, but same to you or similar to you, have influenced me regardless, of their life's passion and trajectory. But yeah, that's awesome, man. That'll be great.
yeah, because the teachings definitely show up everywhere. I mean, the challenge is when you're young like that to be able to see it. I mean, I can look back now and see where I saw it, and now I can see it in all of these different things because I'm a little more aware. I wondered
Yeah.
about when you're working with I mean, I have a 5-year-old who's going to be 6 here, and we had a girl on last week who does this thing called Girl Vanna, and they teach um, yoga and meditation in an environment that's where girls can be really open and raw and honest about what's going on with them. And I was really inspired by that. And it's cool that you're bringing up that work that you do, because you know, when you have a 5 or 6 year old, things are pretty easy, but it's coming
Yeah.
down the way. And I was wondering, what does that look like when you work with these young people? Like, what is the environment where you're connecting with them? And
Yeah.
maybe you could share a little more about that process.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll speak from time to time at whether it's a high school or a college or wherever. But as I'd mentioned, I have this ongoing endeavor that I do with a wonderful facility in Connecticut, and they have other facilities throughout the country, and they bring in people, or not bring in, but they house and help people ages 13 to 20, and they're not just there for drug and alcohol addiction. They're also there for it could be self-harm, depression, anxiety, suicide attempts, anything that essentially falls under the mental health umbrella. And so that I've said, I'm thinking of my girlfriend right now because I probably said it to her most recently, but I leave there every single time equal parts heart filled and just heartbroken. It's especially when, on the one hand, with the female residents where I'm working with them in sessions, I see like the cuts, the very, very deep cuts in their arms, and it literally makes me want to cry because I have cuts on my arms too and my legs, and um, actually I just got a big tattoo on my left thigh the other day, and my girlfriend was with me, and I had like 5 big cuts up my leg, and she's like, "Those aren't stretch marks, are they?" Because she'd never seen them because they were covered in hair, and I was like, "No." And I mean, she knew I used to cut, but anyway, so she saw me, she's like, "Oh, okay." Uh, but yeah, so it's hard to see that. It's hard to hear about the 14, 15, or even 20-year-old. I don't care. Like someone that young that has attempted suicide already, whether it was a cry for help or not. It's very hard, but I'm honored and humbled to be able to go into this particular facility where I do these multiple sessions, and we actually right now we're actually working out of my new book and using that as a form of extended curriculum. And each week I go in, we discuss one of the chapters, because each chapter is a conversation with a different, I guess, quote unquote, expert in their field. So we're looking not just at addiction, but self-defeating behaviors, which again is applicable to any human being. So we're looking at, why do we do the things we do, or why do we return to them? And most importantly, what can we do to begin to truly heal and move past them? And at the end of each chapter is a corresponding practice. And so, yeah, that's the work I've been doing predominantly over the last over a month. The book came out about a month ago. But prior to that, it was still similar. It was still connecting with them. I'm very transparent, as I probably already mentioned. And, I don't go into my war stories so much with them, but I do qualify, which means, for those unfamiliar with programs, like share a little bit about my, I guess, sordid history, and why in fact I am there to talk to them, just so they know that I can relate on one level at least, to why they, to why I am there speaking to them. Um, but yeah, so I mean, that's that. And then if it's more of a high school or college thing, it's very important for me to always share a little bit about my story, just because what I find is that when I allow myself to become raw and vulnerable, and again, just even scratch the surface of some of the things that I've been through, that for most people, it almost automatically allows them to, in turn, kind of start to set some of their heart armor aside and lower their just their guard a bit, and hands go up more frequently, and that's where the conversations and the real healing starts to happen. And that's what's important to me. I don't like going in and talking, whether it is a younger group at the facilities I mentioned, or it's, whoever. I don't want to just sit there and talk at you. I want a dialogue, So that's, yeah. So that's kind of what that looks like. It varies week to week, of course, but the facility itself, this one that I go to particularly, I'm, because I do believe you asked about that. I'm really inspired by their program because, um, as I mentioned, I've been in and out of recovery and treatment programs, back in the day. I went through it many, many times. And what I received was basically like 1 + 1 = 2. Go to meetings, don't pick up, get a sponsor, work the steps, blah, blah, blah. Cool. That definitely works for a lot of people. And I love and honor that. And I do that. And that's part of my program. But I also incorporate other things. And just like you mentioned, there are plenty of people that find their recovery and their healing outside of that. So, what I love about this facility is, they bring in yoga, they bring in people like myself who will talk about things outside of just traditional 12-step recovery, while still honoring and respecting it. They do adventure therapy where they get to, like, I don't know, I think they've done whitewater rafting and zip lining and things that take you out of your comfort zone a bit. So, I'm highly inspired to see treatment facilities going that route these days, where it's incorporating more, I guess at this point it's still out of the box, you could call it, but really not, because it's the stuff that helps us find our recovery, our reclaim ourselves, like reclaim our powers, and yeah. So I don't know. Anyways,
Yeah, I
sorry, I
definitely
tangent a bit.
I like your tangents. You can keep tangenting. I don't think that's how
Appreciate
you
it.
say it, but yeah. I do think that what you were saying about your vulnerability, it definitely builds a bridge that goes both ways. They feel like they can access you and you feel like you can access them. And that's so important. I got that even from just reading the beginning part of your new book where you talked about, the relapse. And it was just, even though I haven't had that exact experience, I could
Yeah.
totally relate to it. It was like,
Mm.
and I have a previous, I have a partner now that we have a child with, but I have a previous marriage that, like I just couldn't show up the way that I probably should have, and all of that. And there's just all sorts of pain. And as you said, like, we've moved beyond that, and bless her for putting up with me all of that time. But I
Sure.
could just
Yeah.
feel it, man. And that's a real inspiration. And I found that even with me, like while I was teaching and connecting with a lot of people and having my Alan Watts curse, all of a sudden when I decided to put the bottle down, and I had been clean for about a year or so, all these people that I had known as students, even for years, came out of the woodwork with stories about addiction that they never shared before because
Sure.
of that
Yeah.
bridge, you know
Yeah.
and it provided this opportunity to serve more people, which is why I do what I do. And I know that what you do, you can really feel it in the sincerity of how you share and in your openness.
Yeah. And that's it. That's like my heart's passion, is that, and that's why I was saying earlier why it is so equal parts heart breaking and heart filling when I leave working with those younger people, particularly. And that's not to exclude anyone else I work with, because it's always heartbreaking, when you work with people that are struggling and essentially, it doesn't even have to be on the verge of, considering taking their life, but just having a hard time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, People that struggle with addiction are often the most sensitive people in the world. So it's very, very, very hard. I guess a hard line of work to endeavor upon if that's something you already struggle with. But yeah, it's like having almost died so many times myself, I feel like there's nothing else that I was going to say I could do, because I mean, I could do a number of things, but I feel called to do. And
Right.
even though it is tough, it's that, it's what I feel compelled to do, to show up and help others. You know, what can I do? How can I help you? What part of my story might potentially, again, potentially help you avoid what I've gone through? And I say that with the clear understanding that I can't save you, and just like no one can save me. I might say something that will click or help, but at the end of the day, it's up to you and only you. So, you've got to do the legwork, lean on other people, find help however you can. But you've got to be the one that makes the decision to do it, and then, back it up and actually do it. So,
Mhm. Yeah, that's the thing. I loved how you said there's nothing else. Not I there's nothing else I could do, but there's nothing else I feel called to do. I can relate. I can totally
yeah.
relate to that. I had one interesting insight while I was cruising through Dead Set on Living on my long walk. And that
Yes.
was
Let's hear it.
uh, Gabor. You had some work with Gabor Mate, who's from Vancouver,
Yeah.
where I live, and I definitely have this come up when I'm working with people, and it's like the conversation around plant medicine. And it was so interesting for me
Mm.
to listen to that part of it because, I'm always saying to people who, when this topic comes up, I'm like, I've done so many psychedelic drugs and all kinds of things, I feel like I'm finished with that. I don't feel like it's necessary. And then, people say, well, what about, it's medicine, and I don't feel called in any way, to use the language that we were using before, to do that, but I
Sure.
definitely have seen the benefits of it. So it sort of makes it
Yeah.
an interesting conversation,
Yeah.
like
So
what
yeah, I
is,
mean,
yeah,
no, I was going to
go.
say, I mean, specifically speaking to that, and I love that, and that's part of the thing is you probably know, having had some experience in traditional 12-step fellowships, there is quite a stigma around literally anything. Doesn't matter
Yeah,
what it is, if it, is even in the slightest bit mind altering, which I always kind of chuckle at, because, the people preaching it are often holding a big cup of coffee, which, as we
yeah, right.
know, caffeine. But anyways, um, I'm not one to judge. So,
Yeah.
but yes, I've personally caught a lot of flack, because even from my first book, I've made it very clear that I've not personally done a psychedelic in well over 10 years, nor did I ever do one in a way that was meant for some sort of spiritual awakening or in a spiritual context. However, um, I have seen firsthand accounts of people that have done them, and particularly people who have struggled with heavy depression or addiction issues. There are also plenty of studies being done at various universities around not just psilocybin or ayahuasca, but MDMA, all sorts of different things in relation to depression, and addiction, but also smoking, and just things like that. So, who is anyone? You know, Essentially, this is what it comes down to for me: is who is anyone to say that you can't do this, you can't do that, this won't help, that won't help? It's going back to earlier, a very highly individualized process. And that's what I appreciate about what Gabor said in that chapter, because I still personally have never done ayahuasca. As I mentioned in that chapter, I've been invited many times. I had a great fear around doing it, because to me, it was a mind altering substance, and I had that, um, what is it? Just I thought, naively, I thought, well, if I do that, then that's probably going to lead to a full blown relapse. And
Mm.
as Gabor makes very clear, no, that's not the case at all. It does not trigger that pleasure center in your brain, so it's not doing that. It's something that he says in his own words, because he's done it plenty of times. He never looks forward to. It makes you
Right.
throw up. It's a very unpleasant at times experience. However, he didn't say this, but I have heard other people say, it's basically like the equivalent of 10 years of therapy, essentially, in one sitting for some people.
Mm.
So yeah, at the end of the day, who is anyone to say? When I use the word drugs, I think of things like crack and heroin, cocaine, things that I can't find any semblance of redeeming value in. However, things like ayahuasca or even marijuana or psilocybin, like, to me, those are medicines. And again, not that they're ones that I use, but they're there. And if they're going to help somebody, fine, so be it. Like, who is anyone to judge? I'm not an advocate for, just numbing out on pills and this and that. However, at the same time, I recognize the benefit and the need. Some people definitely need that in their lives. Often it's just short term, just to help realign our physiology in our bodies, but or our neurochemistry. But we have these wonderful storehouses inside of us. We essentially have a whole pharmacy inside of us already. So once you get through that initial stage of whatever it is you're going through, um, for most of us, and I'm not making a blanket statement, but for many people, they're able to, if they choose to, come off the medications and find a healthier way to live. I'll use myself an example where I spent many years on anti-anxiety medication, depression medication, and came off of that probably over or roughly around at least 10 years ago. And I tapered off. I did it under doctor's supervision. So I want to be very clear that if someone's on it, first of all, there's nothing wrong at all with being on it. I often see shirts that say meditation over medication. And I appreciate the sentiment behind that. I do. I truly do. But there's also a form of shaming in that,
Yeah.
because I know people that do need medication, at least short term. And I say that also understanding that, the AMA, American Medical Association, is in the pocket of big pharma. So they're pushing medications when not necessary on people. But in some situations, they are necessary. And I know in mine it was. And I'm grateful that I had a doctor who helped me wean off of it. And then through right eating, exercise, meditation, things of that nature, I was able to lower my blood pressure right down to a normal level again. My mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being was back on track, and it was just through right living, in all areas. But again, case by case. So if you're on medication, like if you're prescribed it and you need it, I understand. But if it's something that, maybe you've been on for a little longer than intuitively you feel like you need, okay, maybe revisit that and talk to your doctor about it. Or while you're on it, take up a meditation or a yoga practice or, Kundalini, whatever. Like, start incorporating other things. And then if you're interested and it feels right and you're working with a professional, because it is so important, I can't stress this enough. You don't want to just ever stop taking medication. But if you feel like you're at a place where, maybe it's all right, it's time, then, taper off under someone's guidance and expertise, and while replacing it with other more homeopathic and natural ways of well-being. So yeah, again, another diatribe, but all that to say, yes, ayahuasca, marijuana, mushrooms, personally, and it's all subjective, I don't know. I see how under the right context, the right set and setting, they can be very beneficial to the right person in their healing journey. But again, I want to be very clear, it's case by case.
Yeah, I can relate. I have a funny story about, we have one teacher who, he's going to be 80 years old here, and he's been teaching yoga in New York City for 50 years. His name's Dharma Mitra. And
Mm.
one time I was sitting with him, and he said to me, he's from Brazil and has lived in America this whole time, teaching in New York for 50 years, but he still's got like a thick accent. And he said to me, you know what? They have cookies now made from marijuana. And I was like, oh yeah, I knew that. And he said,
Yeah.
my daughter gave me one. And I said, oh yeah? And he said, yes. I said, well, what'd you do? And he said, I ate it. And I said, what happened? And he said, I just sat in the chair like this. And he sat sort of like in an armchair position, since you're listening to this,
Oh boy.
with his
Yeah, yeah.
eyes really wide open. And then he said, it was amazing. He said, and I said, oh, it was amazing. He said, it was, except it leaves a shadow. He said at the end, and
Mm,
I thought, what an interesting way of putting it. And he said, that's what I like about my practice, is it doesn't leave a shadow. And I thought,
mm.
well, that was a profound little insight there from him. And I think there's something maybe to that, and it's not saying all the time, but I did like how you're saying maybe start to explore some of these other things, because what you may experience, that's been my process, is that you're kind of doing all of these things, and then you start to see which ones work and which ones don't. And some of the which
Right.
ones don't may have supported the which ones do in the process,
Right. Yes.
if that makes
And
sense.
it's funny you say that because that makes me think of a story that Maharaji, who was Ram Dass's guru, told him when talking about LSD. Which was a big thing back. I mean, it's still big, but in the '60s, it was like a big explosion here. And Maharaji commented something to the effect of, the West received their medicine in a very materialistic way, in which it needed to. But he went on to say that while LSD can, and this is not a verbatim quote, but while LSD can bring you into the room with Christ, ultimately you are going to have to leave because you're entering based on a substance and not your own volition, or even volition is not the right word, but through your own meditative practice or whatever.
Hmm.
And so that just was reminiscent to me of what your teacher or whomever you spoke with had mentioned to you. Totally similar.
Yes.
So they have their benefits, of course, but yeah, at the same time, right? Like at the end of the day, it always comes down to us and what's inside of us, not what's outside of us that we're ingesting, whether
Mm.
it's chemical related or not, food, sex, shopping, TV, all of it, like uh, when it comes to our healing journeys and our spiritual growth and well being, yeah, completely 100% inside job, bottom line. The other stuff, some of it can help, certainly can help expand consciousness, open up our minds to new ideas, but at the end of the day, yeah, it's up to us, period.
Hmm. I'm glad you brought that up, because I was also thinking about that story. So we got the good psychic connection, and about Maharaji, because I was, a student brought it up during this course that I was speaking at over the weekend, and then they said something to the effect of like, it brings you into the room, but you can't stay in the room. And I had
Right,
said to the
yeah.
student, it's like you've got a backstage pass, but you're not in the band.
Yeah, I love that. Very, very well said. Yes.
So
That is
I'm glad
a
you brought it
completely
up.
Yep, completely apropos. Fucking wonderful. Love it. Very nice.
So we have good timing here.
There it is. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, I definitely, that really spoke to me, that, because I do have moments of, I go through this, I often call it like mental real estate or something with addiction. Like, I think a lot of these substances are neutral, and it's really about how much mental real estate it occupies. Like, I had
Mm,
done this thing with my partner where she occasionally has a drink, and she was
hmm
going through this process for a bit where it was like a glass of wine with dinner, and everybody knows that saying. But she was going through this process where like a glass of wine with dinner would be like, well, then she had two glasses of wine, and then she was asking if she should have had those glasses of wine, and then maybe now she won't have a glass of wine. And then like there's all
mm,
this mental sort of stuff going on. And I said, you might want to take a look at what's going on with that, because it is that like mental self-talk that's sort of where the addictive pattern comes out of. It's not really about the glass of wine anymore. It's about how much space it's occupying in your mind. And you
right.
touched on something really great in the book that I loved, and it was the talking about the comparison. Like, I can't remember who it was, but it was with the, like, what if a child came to you and said that they didn't feel loved and supported at home?
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing here, but uh,
Mm,
and you wouldn't say to them, well, at least you're not being beaten or something like that. And
right.
people do that to themselves. And man, that one really hit home.
Yep. That was actually Gabor's chapter, and I remember that specifically because that's one that's a part of that chapter I will often reference while working at that youth or young adult facility I mentioned.
Hmm.
And that was very important for me to hear. I'm about to turn 40 in June, and still, it doesn't matter how old you are, the majority of us, we are our own worst self-critics. We
Right.
talk so harshly to ourselves. I think it was my first book, could have been second, I think my first, where I said something to the effect of that if I heard somebody else, even if they were two strangers, if I was walking down the street and I heard someone talking to someone else the way that I talk to myself, I would stop and interject. And I'd be like, hey, that's not okay. Like, it is
Right.
not okay for you to talk to this person like that. Yet, when I do it to myself, it's a-okay, and
Right.
so yeah, and that has been a teaching that helps me when I catch myself in that, or again when I'm teaching and sharing with others and helping them try to find new ways of looking at their situations. That is a wonderful, wonderful teaching that, or at least example that Gabor shared was, yeah, would you say that to a 6-year-old? Or I picture my own 6-year-old self, would I say what I'm going through, or compare and contrast it to that 6-year-old? Of course not. I would have a much more compassionate and gentle approach. And that is, to me, a wonderful reminder. So for any of your listeners, if they're going through something right now where they find that they're cognizant of their own, self just deprecation, for lack of better wording, I guess, think about that. Would you say that to your own 6-year-old self, or let alone another 6-year-old? Just picture a little boy or girl. Like, really, would you really say that to them? And if not, why not? And what's the difference? And that's the thing, is what is the difference? And I can't answer that for anyone except myself. So, that's a question that your listeners, everyone, we need to ask ourselves. If I wouldn't say that to a 6-year-old, why not? So,
Hmm.
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's one of my favorite points out of that book. Really, at least personally, just gave me a ton of insight and has helped significantly shift my own self-talk.
Oh, totally. And I think it's something even in recovery that causes a lot of harm for people, even with maybe family members who are saying like, well, you don't have a drinking problem. At least you don't blah, 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 whatever it
Mm,
is, at
yeah,
least you're not, passed out downtown or something. And you're that person who's, maybe you're not drinking that much in comparison, but it's causing you all of this emotional turmoil. or you're trying to change some things in your life, and somebody who's, in a role that's meant to support you is using comparison to keep you bound in your pattern. That's a tough thing to process and to move through.
Yeah, 100%, definitely. And honestly, to that, I mean, aside from what I've said already, it's one of those things where we each subjectively, individually need to find how we can work through it and what feels right for us. Even before that, though, I guess I'm jumping ahead. We need to decide that we want to, because most people don't, or the majority. Like, people, unfortunately, are kind of comfortable with that low level underlying sensation of discomfort, because it's what's familiar. And God forbid we look at what's actually causing that, because that's even way more uncomfortable. But it's not until we do that that we're actually able to heal and begin to re-own and reintegrate these parts of our dissociated selves that we've suppressed and pushed away. That's where the real healing begins, is facing them, becoming intimate with them, becoming raw and vulnerable with ourselves. And again, with the work of others, whether it's a trusted friend or a sponsor in a fellowship or a therapist or a shaman or whomever, whatever the case may be, to each their own. That's where, at least again, in my journey and many people I've worked with, I find that that's where their true healing starts to take off.
Totally. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. And the great thing is that because I started on the third book, I've got all this material to go back and read. So
There you go.
Exciting.
Yeah, I mean, the first two, this is definitely my more, I guess, quote unquote, professional, like actually formatted book. The first two are definitely different, but yeah, this one, it's doing really well, which I'm grateful for, because it's resonating with people and it seems to really be helping. I mean, I've gotten a lot of very humbling, positive feedback on my first two books as well, but this one seems to really just be connecting in a way that's a bit deeper. Because the first two, I guess, I did intertwine a bit more of myself and my own history, and a lot of that revolves around obscure punk rock and hip hop and alternative culture references that, well, people, that didn't understand it could still find it beneficial, may have otherwise been a little bit more lost. Whereas this book definitely does not have nearly as many, and it's just way more focused on let's fucking heal. And I'm sorry, I dropped the F-bomb a few times. I apologize. I have the mouth of a sailor.
That's fine.
You're
not the first. You're not the first one.
Right. Well, this has been very contained for me, so if that means anything. But yeah, really, that's at the end of the day, that's all I care about. Like, let's heal whatever we need to, because once we really begin healing ourselves, then we can show up in the world as a more skillful human being and sincerely just be more kind, compassionate, gentle people towards others. And who knows how far that ripple effect will go. So yeah, that's where I'll leave it.
I often say to people that, I have taken as much positive influence from Yogi Bhajan that I have from Ian MacKaye. So I can relate to you.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is, if you ever go back and read Indie Spiritualist, my first book, a whole chapter is based on a conversation with Ian MacKaye and the lens that skateboarding created for him and how I related it to spiritual living. So, yeah, point in case. That's why those first two books, a little more obscure, but seem like they might be up your alley and perhaps some of your listeners. But yeah, man, what a pleasure. I'm really, really grateful for you having me on the show. This has been a lot of fun.
Good. And can you just let people know how they can find out more about you? And
yeah, if you're interested, I have all sorts of events coming up here and there. I'm based on the East Coast, So the majority of them are out this way, though I do have some West Coast stuff in the works. But essentially, if you want to find me anywhere, just go to my website, theindiespiritualist.com. Indie is spelled INDIE, and then spiritualist, IST.com. And you can find me on social there, my events, my books, links to check out the books, things that people have said about the books. Or if you want to contact me, there's a contact there and it goes into my direct email, and I always respond. It might take me anywhere from 24 to 364 hours. I don't know. It depends on what I have going on, but I promise I respond to every email I get. So, yeah, that is the best way to reach me, through my website, or find out if anyone cares about what I'm doing.
Awesome. Well, thanks again.
Thank you. I really appreciate
Yeah.
the time. This has been lovely. Thanks a lot.
Awesome.